and their attendant evil racism have been the dominant forms of our torture. And national oppression and racism are still very much with us. Black people came to this country as many different nationalities, that is what many of you call tribes. We came as many different nationalities with many different subcultures of the African culture. Our history was systematically eliminated. Slavery, colonialism, imperialism always remove the oppressed from history. The oppressors always tell us that our only history is their history, that we exist as sidekicks for their historic development. Afro-American literature does not come to exist as a genre, that is a body of work, until the early 19th century with the slave narratives. Frederick Douglass' narrative is a signal work, but also there's a fantastic display at the beginning of the 19th century, works by Henry Bibb, Linda Brent, Moses Roper, Box Brown, the Crafts, Wells Brown, James Pennington, Solomon Northrop, and many more. We say that Afro-American literature comes to exist once the Afro-American nationality comes to exist. We did not come to this country as Afro-Americans. We came as many different nationalities of African. The Afro-American nationality comes to exist as an amalgam of different African nationalities and the American experience. We say that Afro-American literature begins as a genre with the slave narratives because these slave narratives begin to ideologically reflect the concerns of the majority of black people. Say the literature of Phyllis Wheatley and Jupiter Hammond and some people who wrote earlier generally is the writing of house slaves who were writing, that is, with the permission of the slave masters. Black people, it was against the law for black people to be literate for the first 200 years in this country. It was against the law for us to learn to read and write. You could be killed for learning to read or write. So that Phyllis Wheatley or Jupiter Hammond, say Phyllis Wheatley writing about how good it is to come to America because now she can be exposed to American culture, is not the ideological reflection of what the masses thought. The masses who were in the fields did not believe that slavery was a good thing. Ditto Jupiter Hammond, who tells us that perhaps slavery is a good thing because it will teach us humility, and so when we get to heaven we'll know how to act around God. Definitely that is not a reflection of what the Afro-American masses, that is the great majority of black people, felt. So that the slave narrative, the anti-slave narrative, is the beginning of the kind of Afro-American literature as a genre that is produced by a new nationality, the African or Afro-American. At the same time that the slave narratives developed, and a little earlier, there were another group of writings that also emerged, a reflection of the struggles in the North with those blacks who were considered free, and I put that in quotation marks, and also next to free I put ha ha on the paper. You can't see that. But this literature was a reflection of the Negro Convention movement, also in the early 19th century. And people like Henry Highland Garnett and C.L. Langston, C.L. Redmond emerged as powerful speaker writers. Also David Walker, whose appeal in 1829 so rocked this slave country that it caused the slave plantation owners to even quarantine black sailors from coming in southern ports. But their fears were not completely unfounded because about 18 months later, Nat Turner rose in the most successful of the rebellions and killed 55 slave owners and their family. And it should be noted that Nat's raid was completely sanctioned by the Bible. That is, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. By the end of the 19th century, millions of black people began to leave the South, but as I said, still 60% still live there, and 8 out of 10 of us, even up here, were born there. They left the South because they were trying to escape from the Ku Klux Klan fascism. They left because the boll weevils had eaten up all the cotton. They left because the capitalists in the North were now advertising for cheap labor because they were getting ready to go on the stage as international imperialists. That is, after they wiped out the Mexicans in the middle of the 19th century, by 1898, then they wiped out Spain. That is, they kicked Spain out of Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines to make those places safe for American investment. And so by the 20th century, the United States wanted to come on the scene as the full-up international imperialists, and so it needed cheap labor. And so it sent out the word for cheap labor, and the blacks began to go north. And if you check the blues of that period, or the literature of that period, a lot of it is about that migration, that northward migration. For instance, here's a couple of blues lyrics. Say, I'm going to get me a job now working in Mr. Ford's place. Say, I'm going to get me a job now working in Mr. Ford's place. Say, that woman told me last night, say, you cannot even stand Mr. Ford's ways. Or, my home's in Texas, what am I doing up here? My home's in Texas, what am I doing up here? Or, I'm a poor old boy a long ways from home. Or, I'd rather drink muddy water and sleep in a hollow log than go up New York City and be treated like a dirty dog. Langston Hughes' important statement in 1926, the Negro artist and the racial mountain, serves as a statement to identify the concerns of a whole generation of black artists, not just writers, but black artists and indeed black intellectuals. He begins, the Negro artist and the racial mountain says, I want to be a poet. He says, one of the most promising of the young Negro poets said to me once, I want to be a poet, not a Negro poet, meaning I believe. I want to write like a white poet, meaning subconsciously. I would like to be a white poet, meaning behind that, I would like to be white. And I was sorry the young man said that, for no great poet has ever been afraid of being himself. And I doubted then that with his desire to run away spiritually from his race, this boy would ever be a great poet. But this is the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America, this urge within the race toward whiteness, the desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible. That's a quote of Langston Hughes written in 1926. Much of the early Harlem Renaissance was black is beautiful, black conscious, attention to African heritage, and you can see the replay in the 60s black arts movement. People like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay were among the most important writers of the Harlem Renaissance, and also the middle writings of that period of W.E.B. Du Bois. And this literature showed the development of a national consciousness that reflects the need first of the people to defend themselves against their oppressors and then to attack them. In the 30s, there was an even sharper struggle in the black liberation movement, of course, because the bottom dropped out of American capitalism. People were on the streets, starving, the depression, similar to I guess we're going through the early phases of a depression right now. But because of this depression, the bottom dropped out of the exotic aspect of the Harlem Renaissance. And so now black writers saw themselves facing an even harsher reality. And the Harlem Renaissance so-called faded, that is, as Hughes said, when black folks were in vogue. The 40s, some of the radical ideas that existed in the 30s continued. Writers not only like Theodore Ward and Richard Wright, but also Margaret Walker and Gwendolyn Brooks. Also, Brooks speaking with the Chicago tongue, Margaret Walker also speaking with the Chicago tongue, but also reflecting the experience of blacks deep in the heartland of the black nation in Mississippi, who still yearn for land, even though they live in the north or in some other city where they labor in the shadow of the plantation. It expresses this longing for land and power somewhere, or our dreams of equality and democracy remain just that, dreams. By the 50s, the United States had emerged from the Second World War relatively unscathed. It became the most powerful nation in the world. And so what they did during the 50s is try to systematically eliminate the radical ideas of the 30s. In other words, they accused these radical writers that existed in the 30s, they accused them of being traitors to their country. Not that told them they weren't trying to transform their country, they were traitors to their country. You heard of that, called McCarthyism. You heard, for instance, of the Hollywood 10 locking up people for thinking. That is, making a kind of inquisition in this country. For black writers, it was especially harsh. W.E.B. Du Bois was indicted as an agent of a foreign power. Richard Wright had to leave the country by 1946 and go to Paris, where he became increasingly more existentialist and less socialist. Langston Hughes was actually made to go down to the House Un-American Activities Committee and cop out before the great humanitarian fascist Senator Eastland and say that he was sorry he had written those terrible works in the 30s, but that he wouldn't do it again. And Paul Robeson was made an exile in his own country. They refused to let him use the concert halls or the stages, refused to give him roles in films and plays, had house Negroes testify against him in the halls of Congress, and finally drove him to his death. At the same time that this came to exist, the so-called new criticism came to exist, where people now told us that writing to be great could have no social consciousness. That to interpret writing, one had to remove it from its social category, from its social context, But you know, one definition of a liar is somebody quoting you out of context. But they said that now the literature had to be removed from its context to understand it. And interestingly, most of these new critics, the core of them, were initiated by a core of Southern white writers like Robert Penn Warren, like John Crow Ransom, like Alan Tate, who said, for instance, that Southern society had produced a great culture except for the relatively minor flaw of slavery. But in the 60s, after this 50s period of reaction, and just after the civil rights literature, in the 60s, another outburst of black literature centered in the major cities in this country emerges. And you can always tell when the literature is about to erupt because the people have already erupted. What the literature reflects is the struggles of the people. So that in 1964, for instance, when Blues for Mr. Charlie opened in February and My Own Dutchman opened in March, and Malcolm X had been speaking before about what would happen in this country, it was only a matter of months until August in the Harlem Rebellion. Or in 1965, the Watts Rebellion. The writers did not create these rebellions, as the judge thought when he sentenced me to 2 years for having written a poem. The writers did not create these rebellions. The writers were reflecting the actual mood of the people and were reflecting what life it was, what life itself actually was. And so in the 60s, the black arts movement, focused in Harlem, but also throughout this country, began to reflect the struggles of the black liberation movement. We wanted to emulate Malcolm X, who came to oppose the black bourgeoisie, who was telling us that we had to turn the other cheek, that we would overcome someday, probably after we were dead. Malcolm X told us about self-determination, self-respect, and self-defense, and so the writers, the young writers of the black arts movement in the 60s wanted to reflect that. People like Clarence Reed and Clarence Franklin, Steve Young, Larry Neal, Sonia Sanchez, Yusef Iman, Sun Ra, Ed Spriggs, Sam Anderson, Welton Smith, Harold Cruz, painters like Joe Overstreet and William White, musicians like Albert Eiler and Sonny Murray and Archie Shepp and Milford Graves and Andrew Hill and Pharaoh Saunders. We were trying to reflect the actual movement of the Afro-American people for liberation. It spread from Harlem to the West Coast, where people like Ed Bullens and Marvin X opened up Black Arts West. In the Midwest, people like Woody King and Ron Milner took up the challenge, opening theaters. And we brought our art into the streets. We performed before thousands of people. We read poetry in vacant lots, on street corners, in playgrounds. We put on plays out in the streets. And so we brought black literature in the 60s to the people at large. Mao Zedong, in an essay called Problems of War and Strategy, points out that in capitalist countries like this one, when the time comes to launch an insurrection in war, that is the civil war between the working class and its allies, and the tiny bourgeoisie and its lackeys, to end capitalism and end national oppression and racism and women's oppression, the first step will be to seize the cities and then advance into the countryside. And at that time, the cities will speak once again. They will speak again at the highest level of our epic, and that will be the most advanced and most beautiful literature that we can conceive of, at least right now. I'll end with these three slogans. Long live revolutionary artists of all nationalities. Liberation of the Afro-American nation. Long live socialist revolution. Thank you.
People keep telling me to put my feet on the ground. I get mad and scream, there is no ground, only shit pieces from dogs and horses and men who don't live anywhere. They tell me, think straight and make something of yourself. Make something. I shout and sigh, I am a poet. I write poems. I make words cartwheel and somersault down pages. Out of my mouth come visions distilled like bootleg whiskey. I am like a radio, but I'm a channel of my own. I keep saying I do this, and people keep asking me, what in the hell am I going to do? What in the hell is going on? Did somebody roll over the library with an atomic truck? Did Hitler really burn all the books? It's true. Nobody in the United States can read or understand English anymore. I must have been the last survivor of a crew from Mars. I mean, this is where someone in brown khaki comes to arrest me, and green X-ray lights come out of my eyes, and I can leap over skyscrapers and fly into the night. I can be sure no one will find me because I am invisible to ordinary human beings in the USA. There are no poets who go to their unemployment officer saying, I'm putting down my profession as a poet. They are sure to send you to another office, the one for aid to totally dependent persons. People keep telling me these are hard times. What are you going to be doing 10 years from now? What in the hell do you think? I'm going to be writing poems. I will have poems inching up the walls of Lincoln Tunnel. I'm going to feed my children poems on rye bread with horseradish. I'm going to send my mailman off with a poem for his wagon, give my doctor a poem for his heart. I am a poet. I am not a part-time poet. I am not an amateur poet. I don't even know who that person could be. Whoever that is authorizing poetry as an avocation is a fraud. Put your own goddamn feet on the ground. Writers do not have to plan another existence forever, to live schizophrenically, to be Jane Doe and Medea in one body. I have had it. I am not going to grow up to be something else. I am going to be old and gray and wizened as Aunt Mamie, and I'm going to write poems till I die. And when I have gotten out of this body, I'm going to hang around in the air and knock over everybody who got their damn feet on the ground.
Was your reading heavily poetic? Did you read very much poetry?
We read a great deal of poetry. It was endemic to the family. And out in Dayton, Ohio, of course, we had the tremendous example of Paul Laurence Dunbar. We grew up both reciting Paul Laurence Dunbar's poetry and hearing it recited. He was a native of Dayton, Ohio. I, as a matter of fact, when I was a member of the Boy Scout troop there in Dayton, was part of a group that took fruit to Dunbar's mother, who was still living on there, a kind of whistler's mother in ebony, as I remember her sitting there. And I have it in my diary. I kept the diary when I was 11 and 12 years of age, and I said, she's getting along fine, but just nobody will go live with her. She was up in her 80s. I was reading I was aware of the poets, and the Harlem Renaissance poets, as well as those you studied in school, the traditional American poets whom we all read and studied. So my thinking was shaped by that. But you know, my feeling is that to the extent that reading influenced my perception of the city, this was truer of foreign cities than it was of those in this country. I think of the time when the first night when I arrived in Paris, and my awareness of Paris had been shaped by my reading of Dumas and de Maupassant and Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. And there was such a great thrill to be in this Paris, which I had become familiar with through my reading. And even more so, I suppose, this was true of Rome. Paris was extraordinary, but it had not really approached the exhilaration I felt that surprised me that I had when I went to Rome, because Rome was antiquity. Rome was the place of the Caesars. And I remember I had known the Lays of Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome. The first afternoon I was there, there were not many people around. I crossed the Tiber and I shouted, those ahead, those behind cried forward, and those ahead cried back. And I suppose they thought it was a pretty odd adult person roaming around. But I had such a sense of Rome from my having read about Rome. Not that much, but certainly there's so much in the literature, even biblical, that gives you a sense of this antiquity of Rome. So that was, I felt it wasn't simply what I saw, but what I had perceived when decades before, the Colosseum, the Senate, the Tiber River, the Forum. I knew all of those before I arrived. My dad's favorite book always acquainted me with one of his, it was the Iliad. He was constantly reciting that. His favorite was those ringing couplets of Pope's translation of the Iliad. And so I was always immersed a bit in antiquity. That, of course, preceded Rome, but still I had that sense of reaching back to that period. Perhaps you could say that the prose is more accessible to masses of people than is the poetry, particularly a more obscure and recondite poetry, a confessional poetry, which is idiosyncratic with the poet himself and his individual experience. But both are important. Here in New Jersey, I think of William Carlos Williams.
Do you think of yourself
Patterson.
as an urban poet?
Yes and no. I think I made some reference to that. It's as I looked over it, I find reflected much of the city in my poetry. It is more cast in this grim mode, which is consonant with Wright's South Side of Chicago and Baldwin's apocalyptic vision of Harlem. I think it's more in that mode than it is in this idyllic past. There's some of that, but not very much. That's very definitely reflected. But also the black heritage, which is very largely rural. It stems from the South. It's the southern rural scene. There's a great deal of that, which I did not experience myself growing up, only indirectly and later on in my life. I did. In the teens, I went south, and I was made much more aware of the terror which dominated the South for black people. And I think that affected my poetry to a great extent. Well, that's a rural scene. So both elements are there. But the city is there. The city is there. The city is Gethsemane. The city is the new Gethsemane for black people as situations turn. It first was the South, but now it's moved to the North. And this experience of a hell, of oppression, has as its cadre the urban environment.
The last time I was home to see my mother, we kissed, exchanged pleasantries and unpleasantries, poured a warm, comforting silence around us, and read separate books. I remembered the first time I consciously saw her. We were living in a three-room apartment on Burns Avenue. Mommy always sat in the dark. I don't know how I knew that, but she did. That night, I stumbled into the kitchen, maybe because I've always been a night person, or perhaps because I had wet the bed. She was sitting on a chair. The room was bathed in moonlight, diffused through tiny window panes. She may have been smoking, but maybe not. Her hair was 3/4 her height, which made me a strong believer in the Samson myth, and very black. I'm sure I just hung there by the door, and I remember thinking, what a beautiful lady. She was very deliberately waiting, perhaps for my father to come home from his night job, or maybe for a dream that had promised to come by. Come here, she said, I'll teach you a poem. I see the moon sees me. God bless the moon, and God bless me. I taught that to my son, who recited it for her, just to say we must learn to bear the pleasures as we have borne the pains.
I feel that a writer's, a creator's objective and intent is to struggle, to wrestle, to come up with a bitter truth about life. And that's a big enough task. And if in a lifetime a writer can manage in whatever his genre or the mode or that he's working in, to manage to capture some shred of truth about human existence and human relationship, then I think we've served our purpose, and that's the most that you can ask for us directly. Because in managing, even in an imaginative way, to capture some aspect of truth, it is that which we feel might illuminate some corner of human existence, and people themselves will recognize it and respond in whatever way they need to, being confronted with the truth. The wonderful thing about theater is that theater can still communicate to even illiterates. I mean, that's the thankful thing about theater, and that it can communicate and is not dependent upon, let's say, somebody reading well or having learned how to read imaginative works.
I myself don't doubt that possibly when
there's some time and distance from this immediate period that the last decade and possibly the last 2 decades in American theater, that any objective assessment of it will probably conclude that the most significant development in American theater has been the rise of the black theater movement itself. For size of population and social and economic position within this culture, I think that the black theater movement was an astounding creative development, and that it will prove as significant to American theater as the, quote, angry young men phase of British theater. I think it was no accident that this very vital movement happened. It did not come out of the inner consciousness or the pondering of the artists themselves. It was a movement which coincided with an upheaval in American society, where black people were trying to define themselves and to fight for what they considered to be their rightful place in American society. It was through this tumult that those artists were stimulated to find their own outlets and forums to artistically, imaginatively deal with the issues of the day, the issues that had endured historically, and so forth, that suddenly a very, very fresh, vital, virile movement developed. And since many of the outlets of this society were closed off, the theater became almost a favorite place for the energies of this impulse to express itself. In saying that, it's, I think, quite obvious that this was essentially an urban experience. This was an art which the theater, which in most of its enduring works dealt with, was by city dwellers, dealt with themes of city life, and parallel the energy, the problems, and everything else that was happening to black people in the larger society as a whole. Just a listing of the plays, starting from Raisin in the Sun, Dutchman, Ceremonies in Dark Old Men, The River Niger, Sty of the Blind Pig, the bulk of Bullen's work, The First Breeze of Summer, The Offering, Colored Girls, Eden, The Mighty Gents. All of these works, in some way, most of them, deal specifically with an urban locale, some instances very literalized, New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago. And I think that in relation to the theme of the conference, that the black theater movement probably typifies more than any other wing of the theater this link between the art and the urban society itself. And I think that that's only natural, because the fate and resolution of black people's existence in this country is dictated and determined by black people's trials and tribulations and triumphs in the major urban centers of this country. And the black participation in the theater is merely reflective of this. I have come to the conclusion that once the black theater movement itself made a thrust for autonomy, which essentially meant black artists
running the institutions and making decisions about what they did. That once that was done, it became very convenient to a certain extent for the larger society and its critics, and sometimes our brother and sister artists, to think, well, that was something that was separate from the larger picture. And consequently, even if the River Niger wins the Toni Award as the best play of the year, and I'm not saying anything about believing in awards, but since it does exist as a value judgment, you will very seldom see a survey or a conclusion which would deal with Mamet and Joe Walker together. It is almost as if the subculture, if you want to put it that way, the art itself is deemed separate, and in some instances, I think, thought to be not up to the par of the majority art. When any realistic, objective assessment of these writers writing in the same period, there are comparisons that are made in terms of similarities and also differences. The one thing is that there's no such thing when black people in America talk about their own autonomy. There's no way that at least what I mean, is that we are able to extricate ourselves from being part of the larger society. And I don't think that there is any way that the larger society, the majority society, can extricate itself from us. I have said to a few my fellow white playwrighs who I've come in contact with at one point that it was possible, in terms of the connection, it is possible that we saved the day for them to become the neo-realists. It was the period in which the black writers resuscitated, if you want to put it that way, the conventional mode of realism, at a point where it seemed that white playwriting had reached a dead end to a certain extent as a group. And we went on and did what we had to do, and finally 5 or 6 or 10 years later, there comes the emergence of a group of, quote, white neo-realists who were not shamed to write some accessible works. So at least half jokingly, sometime I said, well, if during that period of time we held the stage for you to allow you to reemerge out of academia or out of imitation of European modernism to find your own voice. Now I say that maybe an exaggeration, but I think that possibly if there was a real study of all of the writers writing at the same period of time, that you would find that consciously or unconsciously, we do touch. The River Niger and all of the public, the audience that saw the River Niger, spoke to the public that saw it, including the white public. The only thing in terms of subject matter and theme, like any other great art, Sean O'Casey was universal because he spoke about the particulars of his Irish experience, the place, the particularities of what he was going through. It is through the particular that we generalize, that it becomes universal. That does not mean that black writers should cease to write about the particulars of their experience. If they are good enough writers, if they have given us enough dab of truth, it will communicate itself to all other peoples. Its universality will emerge out of its particularity.
Whatever energy one might see in my work is derived from the energy that I receive from the city itself. I grew up right here in Newark in the Ironbound section. All of these sounds and everything tended to make one a little bit more active during the day. I mean, you sort of got into the rhythms of the Bethlehem steel plant behind me, the Barth Smelting Company plant across the street from me, the junkyards down the street, the planes overhead, the boats with the whistles, and you could hear the trains going along the railway right across the river in Harrison. And all these sounds produced their own kind of rhythm. And that rhythm, even though I wasn't aware of it at that time, actually became a part of me. And even though now I live in a much quieter neighborhood, it's very hard for me to get used to because I grew up with those rhythms and sounds of the city. And they manifest themselves in the writing itself that I do, because almost all the plays that I've ever written take place in the city with those same kinds of sounds in my characters' ears and heads and memories that I had when I was coming up. So the city is as it is a very great part of me, it's a great part of the plays that I write, and it's reflected in all of my work. The neighborhood that I grew up in is very much different from Howard Street that Hurd writes about, or it's different from the Newark that Baraka might write about, or the Harlem that Perry Thomas wrote about. My neighborhood had some of the same problems. We had our share of alcoholics. We had our share of people who wound up in Trenton State or Clinton Correctional and all of that. But at the same time, it was a very strong working class neighborhood with people from all walks of life, European immigrants. There was even a Japanese war bride who lived on that street. There was a great many people from the Caribbean, a great many people from Puerto Rico. There were a lot of black people who had come to Newark during the war to work in the defense plants and at the shipyards and things like that, and just stayed on after the war was over. And we all grew up together amidst all those factories and everything, and while it wasn't the easiest of lives, it was a very comfortable life because we had very strong family ties and a very strong neighborhood. And so my view of city life is a little bit at odds with the more preponderant view, which is one of the city is a horrible place full of dark, menacing creatures who are lurking on every street corner ready to grab some kid up.
Has your life in the city shaped the kind of imagination, the kind of perception you bring to your writing?
Well, the last 15 years I've lived in near New York City. And I think what happened was that I got more interested in the kind of life of the village where I had been brought up. So that for me there was a kind of conflict. In some ways it was self-denying, but it seemed to me that when black people in particular related to a city, it wasn't really the city at large, since they had no position of ownership in it. They related really to the concept of the neighborhood or the village within that city. And so that their life was a kind of closed civilization with its own laws, its own version of outlaws, its own rules, which were in many cases different from the laws and the rules of the larger civilization that existed over them. And in the work that I did, and still do in the novels, is to try to show the relationship between those two cultures. And Langston Hughes and all those people who expressed to love the city, in fact did. But when they wax eloquent about it, what they're talking about is that closed population in Harlem, when Harlem was a neighborhood, albeit it was a neighborhood on a grander scale than certainly Lorain, Ohio. But even when you talk to people now who no longer live there, what they remember is the neighborhood quality, and what they deplore about it is the absence of that. The fact that they don't know who those people are. The fact that it is possible for a young man to knock somebody in the head because he does not know who she is. In the old days, he would have seen her on the stoop or if she would be somebody's grandmother, or if they would have gone to church together. Thank you. We come to Chartres, Henry Adams said, for the cathedral that fills our ideal. James Baldwin, looking at the same cathedral, said, I am terrified by the slippery, bottomless well to be found in the crypt down which heretics were hurled to death, and by the obscene, inescapable gargoyles strutting out of the stone. When James Baldwin looked at Chartres, he was doing more than reflecting on what he believed to be the schizophrenia of Western civilization. He was responding to what is universally believed to be the best and the most magnificent features of pre-industrial life from the singular position of a black writer. His is an extraordinary observation for many reasons, one of which is that it brings up the question of how a dispossessed people, a disenfranchised people, a people without orthodox power or orthodox channels of power, views the cities it inhabits but does not have a claim to. When black writers write, whether they profess love of urban life, as Langston Hughes often did, or despise it, as Baldwin seems consistently to do, whether they are awed by the city or terrified of it, the emotion cannot be compared to Sandburg's or Fitzgerald's or Henry James simply because the sources are not the same. Collectively, they have not contributed to the major decisions in founding or shaping the city. Minor decisions, yes. The specious power sometimes of numbers, yes. The fraudulent, repulsive power of the patient, yes. For black people are generally viewed as patients, victims, wards, pathologies in urban settings, not as participants, and they could not share what even the poorest white factory worker or white welfare worker recipient could, and that is feeling in some way that they belonged to the city. Consequently, his literary view of the city and his concept of its opposite, the village or the country, is certainly extremely telling, perhaps more so than the predictable and rather obvious responses of mainstream American writers to post-industrial society, dehumanization, and the curtailing of individualism which they imagined existed in the city but not in the country. It may be that the positive and negative aspects of urbanism can best be articulated by those who know it but have no vested political, cultural, or philosophical interest in supporting or rejecting it as it presently exists, and who seldom see themselves as disengaged from society. In spite of their historical urban labor and enterprise, black-owned oyster houses in Wall Street, black stone masons in Manhattan, iron workers of New Orleans, in spite of that, the affection of black writers, whenever it's displayed for the city, seems to be for the village within it, the neighborhoods, and the population of those neighborhoods. The city itself was a crypt down which heretics were hurled. It was Ellison's underground hideout, Wright's nightmare violence, but what repelled them was not Eliot's wasteland, nor was it the mechanization of life. The horror of industrialization has always seemed to me mostly an elite preoccupation. Laborers seem to have an affinity for machines when they are allowed dominion over them rather than an hostility toward them, perhaps because they are the ones who are familiar with them and who work with them. The anti-urbanism among black writers is not an attitudinal response to that which they perceive as ugly, newly decayed, nor is it nostalgia for something that was once grand. It is not the suffocation of a contemporary Paul Bunyan robotized by the city. Similarly, pro-urban views of city life among these early writers is not the result of the pride and excitement of having created something in them with one's own hands or solved some problem in them of social order. His pro-urbanism, his eagerness for acceptance in the city,
his anxiety to be individually free there, seeking entrance in and associations with the very institutions his white brethren deride, is clearly a statement against segregation rather than a respect for the intrinsic value of the institution itself. The rewards the city can bestow on him are rewards for proving the stereotype to be wrong. Now that makes for some ambivalence and occasionally some contradiction. Langston Hughes professed to love Harlem and loved the glittering skyscrapers downtown. The I in I Too America is obviously we, blacks, and the thrust is integrationist. But unlike Thomas Eliot's river, his river is an urgent connection with and celebration of racial past, not the scene of modern man's futility. While individualism and escape from the community was frequently a major theme in black writing, it should be regarded for what it was. A devotion to self-assertion can be a devotion to discovering distinctive ways of expressing community values, social purpose, mutual regard, or even affirming a collective experience. Now, these community values, which are represented, can be connected to personal self-assertion, and I call them village values, are generally uppermost in the minds of black writers. And it may be this feeling for village values, as opposed to gopher prairie despair, that causes what I believe to be an enormous amount of misadventure in white criticism of black writers. Such critics tend not to trust or respect a hero who prefers the village and its tribal values to heroic loneliness and alienation. When a character defies a village law or shows contempt for its values, it may be seen as a triumph to white writers, a triumph of individual life, personal fulfillment over the moorings and the anchors of small-town life. But while a black reader may view that entirely different as an outrage. What is missing in city fiction and present in most of the village fiction is something that I call the ancestor. The advising, benevolent, protective, wise black ancestor is imagined more often as surviving in the village, but not in the city. The general hostility to the city is not the result of the disappearance of grandeur or the absence of freedom. An idealization of the country is not a pastoral delight in things being right with God. Writer after writer after writer concedes explicitly or implicitly that the ancestor is the matrix of his yearnings. Contemporary black writers seem to view urban life as desirable explicitly, only when the ancestor is there. The worst thing that can happen in the city is when the ancestor becomes merely a parent or an adult and is thereby seen as a betrayer, one who has abandoned his traditional role of advisor with a strong connection to the past. Toni Cade Bambara has written 2 collections of short stories and a novel. Now, she's a New Yorker. She's born and educated in that city, has a rather intimate and fearless knowledge of it. And although the tone of most of her stories is celebratory, full of bravura, joyfully survivalist, the principal fear and grief of her characters is the betrayal of an adult who has abandoned not the role of providing for, but the role of ancestor, advisor, and competent protector. In virtually every one of the 16 stories in Gorilla My Love, only 2 cannot fit that description, and one of those 2, the survivor, describes a city girl going to the country for help, succor, and regeneration at the hands of an elderly aunt who lives up to the demands of an ancestor exactly. The fiction of James Allen McPherson, Leon Forrest, Albert Murray, Paula Marshall, Arthur, so many of those writers becomes doubly fascinating when examined from this point of view. And since the attitudes expressed toward the city and the village does not stem from reactions to post-industrialism, horror of mechanization, or the comfort of an urban intellectual society, the fulfillment or even the promise of a better economic life, I think it is possible to get a deeper and more profound perception of what cities have to offer writers and their impact of the city and village from the work of these black writers. This love of ancestors should not be confused with some simple-minded cant about black families and broken families or historylessness and so on. Dumas does not seek a history, he describes it. Wright does not miss a past, he merely hates it. And what beguiles me is the way in which the absence or presence of the ancestor determines the success of the protagonist. For the ancestor is not only wise, he or she values a racial connection, racial memory over individual fulfillment. Fighting the ancestor frequently occurs, but the devastation of the protagonist never occurs unless he ignores or annihilates the ancestor. Like Baldwin, these writers have seen the slippery, bottomless well to be found in the crypt, in the city at its best, its most beautiful and ideal. But that is not what impales them, and that is not what gashes their life. It is the absence of the ancestor who cannot thrive easily in the dungeon of the city. For the true ancestor is frequently a social or secret outlaw, like Ellison's grandfather on his deathbed, saying, "I never told you, but our life is a war, and I have been a traitor all my born days, a spy in the enemy's country." They provide alternate wisdom. They suggest we be cautious of charge. They establish and maintain and sustain generations in a hostile land. Huckleberry Finn lights out to the territory as escape and the fulfillment of a personal free life. Nigger Jim is hiding there, but his wish is to go home, to the village. Without that presence and recognition, there is no life, and it is for this reason, I believe, that among black writers, the city has huge limits, and the village has profound values. Thank you.
I was born in the Congo. I walked to the Fertile Crescent and built the Sphinx. I designed a pyramid so tough that a star that only glows every 100 years falls into the center, giving divine, perfect light. I am bad. I sat on the throne drinking nectar with Allah. I got hot and sent an ice age to Europe to cool my thirst. My oldest daughter is Nefertiti. The tears from my birth pains created the Nile. I am a beautiful woman. I gazed on the forest and burned out the Sahara Desert. With a packet of goat's meat and a change of clothes, I crossed it in 2 hours. I am a gazelle. So swift, you can't catch me. For a birthday present when he was 3, I gave my son Hannibal an elephant. He gave me Rome for Mother's Day. My strength flows ever on. My son Noah built Newark, and I stood proudly at the helm as we sailed on a soft summer day. I turned myself into myself and was Jesus. Men intoned my loving name. All praises, I am the one who would save. I sowed diamonds in my backyard. My bowels deliver uranium. The filings from my fingernails are semi-precious jewels. On a trip north, I caught a cold and blew my nose, giving oil to the Arab world. I am so hip, even my errors are correct. I sailed west to reach east and had to round off the earth as I went. The hair from my head thinned and gold was laid across 3 continents. I am so perfect, so divine, so ethereal, so surreal, I cannot be comprehended except by my permission. I mean, I can fly like a bird in the sky.
So something is happening. I am aware very strongly of living in a period when the vocabulary is about to change. Some very serious and irrevocable transition is taking place. I suspect it's an improvement, but I'm not certain. At any rate, it's a profound change.
So you see yourself as a didactic writer. I mean, that's a bad word for many people. But I take it you do, in fact, see yourself as a didactic
If
writer.
I can do it without the rhetoric and the harangue, and I can only do it by making them care about the people in the books and what happens to them.
Do you think of this as the principal purpose of your writing?
To bear witness, yes.
To bear witness.
Absolutely.
And what relation would you suggest? And this is an old question indeed. You know, you can go back and read Philip Sidney's Apology, poetry, and come up with the same question. What relation between the value of literature as revelation? Let me show you something that you will never see elsewhere. What relation between that and let me teach you something that you might otherwise not know?
Well, mine is probably a third possibility, is let me help you recollect something that you already know but may have forgotten.
Toni Morrison, thank you very much for being with us.